Welcome to our lesson on the aorist passive indicative verb. The aorist passive forms are really all we need to worry about here, because there's nothing new to understand about the meaning or the use of aorist passive verbs. You already know how the passive voice works, and the subject of the verb here again is what receives the action of the verb, just as in the present tense. The aorist, though, uses distinct forms for the passive voice, where with the present we were able to use one form for both middle voice and passive. Again, with the aorist passive, we have two kinds of pattern: the first aorist passive and the second aorist passive. But this doesn't line up neatly with the first and second aorist of the active and middle voices. Most verbs become first aorist in the passive voice. Now that's good news, because it means that we don't have nearly as much to remember. Many second aorist active verbs are first aorist in the passive. They keep their changed aorist stems in the passive voice, but as you'll see, when we're distinguishing between the forms of the first aorist passive and the second aorist passive, they follow the pattern that we're going to call the first aorist passive. This will be clearer in a few minutes when we can look at some examples. Only 32 verbs in the New Testament, in fact, are second aorist passives, although strangely enough some of those are first aorists when they're in the active voice. Is this confusing you yet? Well, again, we'll make things clear momentarily. Let's look at what we call the first aorist passive forms. This should be reasonably familiar to you. Here we have the augment, because we're in the indicative mood, and we're dealing with a tense that is usually past time. Then we have the verb stem, and here we're using our old friend luo. Then, instead of the sigma that was the tense marker in the first aorist active, here we have a theta. And instead of the alpha connecting vowel that was familiar from the first aorist active verbs, we have now an eta connecting vowel. And then on the end, we put the same endings that were familiar with many of the earlier verb forms. So in the first person singular, we would have eleuthein as our first aorist passive form. And that would mean I, because this is the first person ending, I am, or I was, loosed. Here are the endings when we put the theta tense marker, the eta connecting vowel, and then the actual person and number ending on the end. The first person singular is thein, the second person singular is theis, the third person singular is they. The first person plural is themin, the second person plural is theta, and the third person plural is theson. So you can see how if you know your first and second aorist endings from the active mood, and you know that what marks the first aorist passive is they, the combination of the theta tense marker and eta connecting vowel, it's not difficult to at all to figure out what the exact ending is going to be for this first aorist passive. Let's look at how this works out in detail with the verb luo. The first person singular is going to be eleuthein, and that would mean I was loosed again. The second person singular will be eleutheis, and that would mean you singular were loosed, or you were set free. The third person singular would be eleuthe, and that would mean he, she, or it was loosed. Moving over to the plural, the first person plural would be eleuthemen, we were loosed. The second person plural would be eleutheta, you, plural, were loosed. And the third person plural would be eleutheson, they were loosed. Now for most verbs, that's really all we need to know. That's the aorist passive. But let's look at some of the predictable but sneaky changes that we can run into. Here we have a set of verbs that actually are regular first aorist verbs. But it's not quite as simple as connecting all of the components of the verb together, because we're going to see some changes. Particularly, we're going to have changes when this theta tense marker runs up against a consonant at the end of the stem. And we may find changes when an epsilon, the augment, runs into a similar vowel at the beginning of the verb stem. So those are two places where we've seen changes to regular forms before. In the first aorist, that was very common, and also the augment tricks in the second aorist. But let's look at exactly how this works out. So here's the verb blepo. We would expect to take the ending off and leave us with the stem blep. We put the augment on the beginning. We add the theta and the eta connecting vowel, and then the person and number ending. So we might guess that the aorist passive form of blepo would be eblepthane. The only trick here is the P at the end of the blep stem, when it runs up against the theta, which is a fricative consonant, the th sound, it makes the P go rough or fricative as well. So instead of blep, the stem becomes blef with an F sound. So the aorist passive form is eblepthane. Now if you remember that P class or B class vowels will tend to soften in front of the theta to become a phi, then this actually won't be too surprising. And eblepthane means I was seen. Didomi isn't irregular at all, really, as long as we remember that the real stem of these me verbs doesn't show up obviously in the present active indicative forms. So the real stem of didomi is da. And once we remember that, we add on the augment, the theta, eta connecting vowel, ending, and we get edothane, I was given. Similarly, with histemi, another verb that shows up quite a lot, if we remember that the real stem of histemi is sta, then we won't be surprised here that the aorist passive form is estathane, I was stood, or I was stood up. With kaleo, we run into a slightly different issue, and that is that there was stem change in the first aorist form, eklesa. So instead of ekalesa, the alpha dropped out in the first aorist, and we got an aorist stem that was just kle. When there's stem change like that in the aorist active, whether the verb was a first aorist active or a second aorist active, usually we're going to use that changed aorist stem in the aorist passive. So here we're using the kle stem again, and that becomes eklethane. Now we have clay instead of kle in the final form because short vowels, epsilon, alpha, omicron, in front of the tense indicator, which here is theta, will tend to lengthen. So an epsilon or an alpha will tend to lengthen to an eta. So cle, when you add on the theta, becomes clay. So I hope you can see that at bottom, these are very regular aorist passive forms. The only thing that you really have to watch for is things like softening of final consonants or lengthening of final vowels before the tense marker. And you have to remember with me verbs that the present active indicative doesn't give you the real stem. So we need to remember the real stem and base the aorist passive forms on that. There are, though, some truly irregular first aorist passive verbs. One is lambano, and the aorist, second aorist of lambano is elabon, so we're going to use that irregular changed second aorist stem lab from elabon. But we don't just get elabthane or even elapthane. We get elapthane. So how does that happen? Well, we have a little bit more irregularity here. The alpha of lab lengthens to an eta, even though it's not at the end of the stem. And then, less surprisingly, the beta, which again is part of that P class, B class set of consonants, goes rough or fricative in front of the theta. And so we get elapthane, slightly irregular. That means I was taken or I was received. Horao is quite a bit more surprising because the stem that we're going to work with for the aorist passive doesn't look anything like the present tense stem, and it's not the same as the aorist stem that we used for the aorist active indicative. In the passive, aorist passive voice, the stem we use for horao is op. Now, where do we get this from? Remember that the future active indicative of horao was opsomai, and that actually is derived from this same stem, op. And what has happened here, as sometimes happens, is that horao bumps up against another verb, which might have been something like apo, that is falling out of use. And because horao needs an aorist passive form, needs a future form, what horao does is borrow the future form and the aorist passive form from this other verb op, because it's passing out of use, it doesn't need them anymore. That's why we go from horao in the present active indicative to this strange thing, ophthane, in the aorist passive. How do we get there? Well, if you take op, and if you add the epsilon augment on the beginning, the epsilon and the omicron will come together, and sometimes what happens is that lengthens the omicron into an omega. Okay, so we might think that this is ophthane. But again, predictably, the theta makes the P rough into a phi, and so we get ophthane. I was seen. So the key with horao is just to remember that we're working with a different stem that's been borrowed from another verb when we get to the aorist passive. Lego is a slightly different issue, although again it's surprising. The aorist stem of Lego is ep, and that is how we get the aorist active indicative form apon. But we don't use that ep stem to form the aorist passive. For some reason with Lego, we go back to the present stem. And this doesn't happen very often at all. But with Lego, we go back to the leg stem instead of using the aorist stem ep. And so then we add the augment, an eleg, and then we add thane on the end. The theta running up against the gamma, again, softens the gamma, and when a gamma or a kappa gets softened, it becomes a he. And so now we have elechthane, I was spoken. Translation's a little bit awkward, but you can see, I think, how the passive sense is conveyed. So those are three examples that you're going to run into of relatively common verbs that in one way or another are slightly irregular in their aorist passive form. But we do run into these often enough that they're not too difficult to remember. And if we can remember what stem we're working from, then actually these irregularities aren't too bad. So, what is the second aorist? Again, we said that whether a verb was first or second aorist in the active voice really has little to do with whether the verb is going to be first or second aorist in the passive, and that most verbs are first aorist passive. So what is the second aorist passive? It's very similar. We have the augment on the beginning, again, because we're in the indicative mood. We still have that eta connecting vowel, and we're going to use exactly the same endings to indicate the person and number. The only difference is that we're not going to add the theta tense marker. Now, for a verb like grapho, which shows up fairly often and is one of our second aorist passive verbs, this can be a little bit tricky because you're going to get used to looking for that theta-eta combination as the signal that we're dealing with an aorist passive. Along comes a form like agraphason, and you don't see any theta. You don't see that the in the middle between the stem and the ending. And so you might not have the idea of the aorist passive triggered in your mind by that theta. That's why it's important to remember that with some of these verbs, just the presence of eta as a connecting vowel can be a signal that you need to be thinking about aorist passive. Now, later on we're going to find in future lessons that there are a few other places where eta can serve as the connecting vowel before the endings. But what's important is just that the possibility that this is an aorist passive verb we're dealing with should be cued in our minds just by the presence of that eta connecting vowel. And then we can, if necessary, look up the word in our vocabulary list or in our lexicon and take a look to see if there's any special irregular aorist passive form, or whether indeed it's just a second aorist passive. So to sum up the form itself, all you have to remember is that the tense marker, the theta, isn't inserted between the stem and the eta connecting vowel for the second aorist passive. As you can see, the endings are going to be the same, except that we're lacking the theta. So in the first person singular, the second aorist passive ending, instead of thane, is just going to be ain. Instead of thase, second person is going to be ace. Instead of the second person is going to be a. Instead of thamen, amen. Instead of theta, eta. Instead of theson, ason. And so let's look at how that works with all of the forms of grapho in the second aorist passive. The first person singular will be not agrapthane, but agraphane. And we can see here possibly how the second aorist passive forms came about. It could be that when there's already a phi on the end of the stem, graph, that it seemed maybe redundant or hard to pronounce for the Greeks to add a theta on right up against that existing phi. So that could be why the theta just got dropped out. In any case, that the first person singular form is agraphein, I was written. The second person singular form is agraphes, you were written. The third person singular form is agraphe, he, she, or it was written. In the plural, the first person is agraphemen, we were written. In the second person plural, we have agrapheta, you, plural, were written. And in the third person plural, we have agrapheson, they were written. Once again, you can learn more about the aorist passive verbs in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek and sections 24.1 to 24.12. That's on pages 213 to 215.